Amniotes evolved from amphibian ancestors during the Carboniferous period and further diverged into two groups, namely the sauropsids that will begin reptiles and birds and synapsids that will begin mammals. They are distinguished from the other living tetrapod clade by the development of three extraembryonic membranes, thicker and keratinized skin and costal respiration. Cassaniria was a small animal with a postcranial length estimated to have been 15 centimeters. Its small size would have made it ideal for hunting the invertebrates of the Carboniferous. It had 5 fingers, with the bones at the fingertip being tapering and curved. This spurred the initial describers to argue that it was the oldest known animal with claws on each hand, and marks the earliest clawed foot. Claws are extremely rare among amphibians, but ubiquitous among amniotes, so their supposed presence in Cassaniria has been considered to be evidence towards its amniote identity. Claws are also a feature intimately bound to the formation of keratinous scales in reptiles, so in life, Cassaniria would have borne scaly, reptilian-type skin, and would have resembled a small lizard. Cabarzia lived during the early Permian in what is now Germany. Despite its very lizard-like appearance, it was actually part of the Varanopid lineage, a group of scaly amniotes traditionally classified as early synapsids, but which more recently have been proposed to instead be sauropsid reptiles closer related to early diapsids. Its short arms, long legs, slender body and long tail suggest it was capable of shifting into a bipedal posture when running at high speeds, similarly to some modern lizards, probably mainly to escape from larger predators, but possibly also used to pursue fast-moving prey like flying insects. This makes Cabarzia the earliest known example of an animal running on 2 legs. Although very lizard-like in appearance, Eudybomus was actually part of a completely extinct group known as Parareptiles, a diverse group of early sauropsids who were once thought to be the ancestors of turtles, but are now considered to instead be the evolutionary cousins to the true reptiles. The structure and proportions of its limbs suggest it could run fast on its hind legs, making it one of the earliest known examples of bipedal locomotion. Since its teeth were adapted for an herbivorous diet, it wasn't using its speed to chase down prey but was instead probably sprinting away from predators. It may have been capable of holding its legs in a more upright position directly under its body, convergently evolving a more energy-efficient posture similar to that of later bipedal animals like dinosaurs. Mesosaurus was one of the earliest aquatic reptiles, returning to the water only about 10 to 15 million years after the first true reptiles emerged in the late Carboniferous. About 1 meter long, it lived in shallow coastal waters and hypersaline lagoons, and had long jaws full of needle-shaped teeth, probably preying on small fish and crustaceans. Fossils of this animal were significant in providing evidence for the theory of continental drift in the mid-20th century. Found in both South America and southern Africa, but incapable of crossing the vast open ocean of the southern Atlantic, the presence of Mesosaurus in both locations suggested that the continents had once been joined. Mesosaurus may also represent the earliest known example of live birth in the fossil record, with one specimen preserving a developing embryo. Compared to most Eureptiles, Parareptiles retained fairly primitive characteristics such as robust, low-slung bodies and large supratemporal bones at the back of the skull. While all but the earliest Eureptiles were diapsids, with 2 openings at the back of the skull, Parareptiles were generally more conservative in the extent of temporal fenestration. Lanthanosuchus is a genus of parareptile that lived in what is now Russia during the late Permian. Procolophon reached a length up to 30 centimeters, and is considered to have been a small herbivore or insectivore. Its skull is distinct because of its lateral-posteriorly facing paired cheek spikes, along with spiked dermal ossicles. Paleontologists debate the function of the cheek spikes. Some paleontologists posit that the bony protrusions were points for muscle attachments. Procolophon also had large eyes, and may have had acute night vision. Its teeth were peg-like and suitable for crushing plant matter. The front of the skull was short and blunt with the nasal opening very close to the mouth. Although known only from partial skull fossils, Colobomicter's full size was probably around 30 centimeters long. It had huge fangs at the front of its jaws, along with a few other enlarged teeth further back, all with serrated edges that show it was clearly a predator. What exactly it was feeding on with this unusual tooth arrangement is unknown, but proposed ideas include piercing through hard-shelled arthropods, or stabbing into smaller vertebrate prey. A procolophonomorph parareptile from Russia, Reptilosaurus lived during the mid-Permian. It was originally placed within its own group, the Reptilosauridae, though later analysis seems to place Reptilosaurus somewhere between being a nycteroletterid to a basal paraisaur. It is around a meter long, larger than any other nycteroletterids and closer in size to later paraisaurs. The small size of Elginia is in stark contrast to the larger paraisaurs such as Scutosaurus. This reduction in size is often considered an adaptation to the harsh conditions of the end of the Permian. Elginia has a number of spikes protruding from its skull, the largest pair rising from the sides at the top and back of the head. It's thought that these horns were primarily for display. Buenostegos has been described as about the size of a modern cow with a knobless skull and bony plate armor on its back. Its teeth show it to have been a plant eater. It lived in an isolated desert region of the supercontinent of Pangaea some 260 million years ago. Its home region appears to have supported a distinctive fauna, in contrast to the rest of the supercontinent, where species were broadly distributed. It is particularly notable for the large bony knobs on its head, bigger than any seen in other species of paraisaur. In life they were probably skin-covered horns or ossicones similar to those of modern giraffes. They are thought not to have served a protective function but were probably purely ornamental, perhaps aiding recognition between or within particular species. Periosaurus is a large quadruped, about 2.5 meters long, with elephantine legs, walking in a typically reptilian posture. The skull is broad and the snout short. Its skull had several spine and wart-like protrusions. Periosaurus's leaf-shaped teeth, ideal for biting through tough plant fibers, indicate it was an herbivore. Even the palate had teeth. Unlike other paraisaurs, Scutosaurus's orientation of the legs was more under the body as opposed to out to the side. This gave it a much taller stance and would be more suitable for a creature that may have spent its time searching for suitable vegetation to eat in the arid environment of the time. Scutosaurus had a heavy frame of bones supported by a network of powerful muscles. This in turn was covered by a tough hide that was covered with osteoderms for enhanced armor, providing it with its best defense as it was not an animal built for speed. The teeth inside its mouth were evolved for grinding the arid vegetation of the time before being processed in the gut. It had exceptional hearing and may have been able to bellow loudly to call others of its species. Hylonomus is the earliest unquestionable reptile. Most of them are 20 centimeters long and probably would have looked rather similar to modern lizards. It had small sharp teeth and it likely ate small invertebrates such as millipedes or early insects. They are also described to have slender and lightweight leg and arm bones, as well as long and slim hands and feet. Despite being amongst the oldest known reptiles, it is not the most primitive member of group, being a Eureptile more derived than either Parareptiles. Petrolacosaurus teeth were of moderate length, slightly recurved and possessed no lateral compression. The teeth located on the transverse flange of the pterygoid were significantly larger than the others, indicating that these teeth were specialized for grabbing smaller, hard-shelled insects. Its jaws were long and slender. Based on the skeletal muscle attachment points and the shortened temporal region, adductor muscles would have had limited amounts of leverage, resulting in a quick but weak bite. This is further support for the hypothesis that it was insectivorous. The mud that the reptile was fossilized in is known to create well-preserved insect and plant prints, allowing extrapolation about the surrounding environment. Because of fossil evidence of winged insects, the fruits of conifers, and other pteridosperms, Petrolacosaurus is thought to be a completely terrestrial reptile that lived in a conifer fern forest. Arioceles was a superficially lizard-like animal that lived during the mid-Permian in what is now Texas. About 60 centimeters long, it had a slender body, proportionally long legs, and a solidly built skull with strong teeth, suggesting that it was a fast runner that specialized in cracking open the carapaces of thick-shelled prey. It was one of the last known members of a lineage known as Ariocelidians, which are usually considered to be very early members of the diapsid reptiles, but a recent study has proposed they might have even more ancient roots than that, possibly being a branch of stem amniotes instead. The 30 centimeters long Spinoequalis, known from fossils found in Kansas, was one of the first diapsids, along with Petrolacosaurus. It was also the first reptile to return to the water, evolving shortly after Hylonomus, the oldest confirmed reptile. Spinoequalis was not fully aquatic, frequently returning to dry land. It probably swam using its laterally flattened, fanned tail. Its name means symmetrical spine, referring to its deep, laterally compressed tail. It has been found along with beautifully preserved marine fish, suggesting it occasionally left fresh water streams for the sea. Young Ina is a genus of diapsid reptile that lived in what is now South Africa during the late Permian. The skull is roughly triangular with a snout that is about half the total length of the skull. The teeth are conical and well developed, and may have been used for killing larger invertebrates and small vertebrates. Claudiosaurus is generally assumed to have been an amphibious animal, using its limbs for propulsion, though it was still likely capable of walking on land, and the skeleton shows only limited adaptations to aquatic life. It has been suggested to have fed on small invertebrates, such as crustaceans. Havasaurus was one of the largest tangosaurids and was also highly specialized for aquatic life in freshwater rivers, with an eel-like tail twice the length of the rest of its body and heavy thickened ribs. Hundreds of fossils have been found representing life stages from hatchling to adult, and juvenile Havasaurus actually seem to have been almost fully aquatic. They had proportionally shorter limbs and may have behaved similarly to modern sea turtles, crawling into the water shortly after hatching and only returning to land as adults once they had longer, better developed legs. Many fossils also preserve clusters of pebbles in their abdominal cavities, which are thought to have been used as extra ballast to help weigh them down in the water when hunting small fish and invertebrates. Coelurosaurus here was a Weigeltisaurid living in what is now Madagascar, which at the time was part of southern Pangaea. Its body was adapted for a life climbing and gliding around in the treetops, with pneumatized air spaces lightening its bones and long slender limbs similar to those of modern tree-climbing lizards. Its large wings were formed from around 30 pairs of long hollow rod-shaped bones extending out from the sides of its belly. These flexible structures could furl and unfurl with a motion like a foldable fan, and are thought to have been highly modified from osteoderms in the skin, creating an entirely new part of its skeleton. Longisquama lived between the Middle and Late Triassic in the Kyrgyz Republic. Only the front half of the skeleton is known, poorly preserved with a badly crushed skull, and the best thing we can say about its evolutionary relationships is that it was some sort of lizard-like reptile. It probably wouldn't be a particularly notable animal if not for the row of relatively enormous plume-like structures growing from the skin of its back. These appendages were probably some sort of long ribbon-like scales, but are also frequently claimed to be feathers by shitty pseudoscientists. Also, the plumes might possibly be plant fronds that a Longisquama just happened to die on top of. I don't personally agree with that idea. They don't fully match any known plants from the same fossil beds, and aren't preserved in the same manner, but in the absence of more unambiguous fossils it's still a valid argument. Hyperonectar, a basal drepanosaur from the late Triassic of New Jersey. Only around 12 centimeters long, it's known from several incomplete fossils and was originally described as an aquatic reptile due to its flat paddle-like tail, but the thin delicate bones and inflexible structure of the tail wouldn't actually have made it very useful for swimming at all. It's more likely that Hyperonectar was a tree climber like its relatives, with its odd leaf-shaped tail perhaps being used for some sort of display or camouflage. It was probably still capable of swimming if it needed to, much like many other terrestrial animals, but it wouldn't necessarily have been good at it. Possibly it would have moved somewhat like a modern chameleon in the water. Drepanosaurs were already some extremely weird animals, even among all the other weirdos of the Triassic period. New discoveries show that some members of this bizarre group were doing something different. Ancestronicus lived during the late Triassic, measuring around 50 centimeters long. Its enormous hand claws were unusual compared to its close relatives, with a distinctly wide and hooked shovel-like shape. Along with the weird burly arms of Drepanosaurus, this suggests that instead of tree climbing some drepanosaurs were instead much more specialized for digging. They may have been Triassic equivalents to modern anteaters or pangolins, using their enlarged claws to excavate burrows and rip their way into insect nests. Drepanosaurus is known from just one specimen, missing the head and neck, and at around 50 centimeters long it was the largest of the drepanosaurs. It had a long lizard-like body, a bony hump over their shoulders, grasping limbs like a chameleon, long necks and small superficially bird-like skulls, and a grasping prehensile tail with a claw on the end, formed from fused and heavily modified vertebrae. It also had an enormously enlarged claw on each hand, and unique arrangement of the lower arm bones. The ulna was modified into a large crescent-shaped bone at the elbow used for attaching muscles, and one of the wrist bones was elongated to serve as a replacement ulna instead. Megalencosaurus was fairly small. Its adult length was only about 25 centimeters. It was built like a chameleon and probably lived a similar arboreal lifestyle, feeding on insects and other small animals. Even its feet were chameleon-like, with 2 toes being opposed to the remaining 3. The tail is long, prehensile, and bears a strange claw-like organ made of fused vertebrae at its end. Its head is superficially very bird-like. The eyes were large and the snout was narrow. Towards the tip of the snout were 2 small premaxillary teeth, which were separated by a diastema from at least 22 small maxillary teeth. The orbits were directed anteriorly, suggesting that Megalencosaurus had good binocular vision. Hyphalosaurus was aquatic, a lifestyle reflected by their long necks and tails and relatively small limbs. Superficially, they resembled miniature plesiosaurs, though this resemblance arose convergently and does not reflect a close relationship. It was among the most aquatically adapted Choristoderans, with smoother, flatter scales than its relatives, a tall and flattened tail for swimming, a long neck and webbed feet. Because the torso was fairly inflexible and the limbs were not particularly adapted for aquatic life, it probably swam using mainly its tall, flattened tail. The chest was barrel-shaped and made up of thick, heavy rib bones which would have helped Hyphalosaurus stay submerged. It appears to have exclusively inhabited deep-water lakes. All specimens are preserved in silt characteristic of the deepest part of the lake environment, and are often preserved alongside deep-water fish and crustaceans. In 2006, the UK Royal Society announced that it had discovered a two-headed fossil of Hyphalosaurus, the first recorded time that such a reptile has been found fossilized and the oldest known case of polycephaly. The Choristoderes were a group of aquatic reptiles that mostly inhabited freshwater environments. Their evolutionary origins and relationships are very unclear, with the only real certainty being that they're at least diapsids. A small number of fossils of a little Choristodera named Lazarussicus have been found in a few different places around Europe, with the youngest specimens dating to as recently as the early Miocene. Surprisingly, it wasn't closely related to the Neochoristoderes at all, but instead seems to have been part of a much older and more primitive branch of the Choristodera family tree that must have been surviving since at least the mid-Jurassic, with very little presence in the fossil record. It was less aquatic than most other Choristoderes, with large claws that would have given it good traction on land and a more generalized lizard-like body plan. One specimen even preserves soft tissue impressions, showing that its toes lacked webbing and that it had a low crest running along its tail. Its lack of specialization may have been the reason for its longer survival, being able to adapt to a wider variety of environments compared to its more water-reliant cousins. Shamsasaurus might look a lot like an unarmored crocodilian, but it was actually only very distantly related to them. Its very gharial-like appearance was the result of convergent evolution. It had a flattened skull that was very wide at the back, supporting powerful jaw muscles, with a long narrow toothy snout that could sweep rapidly through the water to snap at fish in a similar manner to modern gharials. Its nostrils were right at the tip of its snout, and it may have used it like a snorkel, only sticking the very end out of the water to breathe. There also seems to have been some sexual dimorphism in this species, with females having much more well-developed limb bones, allowing them to occasionally haul themselves out onto the shore to lay eggs, while males were probably fully aquatic and unable to support themselves on land. Thalattosauria is an extinct order of prehistoric marine reptiles that lived in the Middle to Late Triassic. They were endemic to the Tethys Ocean. Their fossils have been found in Europe and China, and they were likely semi-aquatic fish eaters with straight snouts and decent terrestrial abilities. Thalattosauroids were more specialized for aquatic life, and most had unusual downturned snouts and crushing dentition. Apart from its unique cranial features, Myodentosaurus has characteristically flat front claws, and the two specimens known were both more than 4 meters long, making it one of the largest thalattosaurs known. Thalattosauria evolutionary relationships are unclear beyond. They were some sort of diapsid reptile, and they were well adapted for aquatic life, with streamlined lizard-like bodies, short limbs with webbed feet, and long paddle-like tails. Hespelia was one of the strangest. It was one of the smaller known species, around 1 meter long, and had a particularly bizarre-looking head. Its snout was so sharply curved downward that it formed a right-angled hook relative to the rest of its jaws, sort of resembling the initial interpretation of Atopodentatus but without the vertical split. This weird arrangement must have been highly specialized for something, but its actual function is still unknown. One suggestion is that the large jaw spikes were used to crunch into hard-shelled prey, although there doesn't seem to have been any reinforced surface in the upper jaw for them to crush against. Like all thalattosaurs, Concavispina was a marine reptile that probably swam by lateral undulation or side-to-side movement of its elongated body. The limbs are too short to have provided much propulsive power. It was probably not as strong a swimmer as its closest relative Zimpusaurus because it has shorter neural spines with V-shaped notches, which would have reduced the surface area over which the semispinalis muscle could anchor. Although Concavispina and Zimpusaurus both had pointed teeth at the front of the jaw and blunter teeth towards the front, Zimpusaurus's teeth were larger and more robust in general. This may support the hypothesis that Concavispina fed on relatively soft-bodied animals such as fish and jellyfish, while Zimpusaurus may have fed on harder prey with shells. Xenpusaurus is known from the late Triassic of China. About 1.3 meters long, with half of that being its paddle-like tail, it had an elongated upper jaw that formed a protruding pointed spear-shaped snout. It's not clear whether this odd snoot was an adaptation for hunting similar to the long bills of swordfish. There's quite a bit of variation in length and shape between different individual specimens, or if it was serving some other purpose like the sexually dimorphic noses of some modern lizards. Back in the 80s, a fossil of a partial reptile skull was discovered in British Columbia, dating to the early Triassic about 250 million years ago. Its triangular skull shape, large eye sockets, and what seemed to be distinctive spiky frills on the back of its head initially caused it to be identified as a relative of the gliding Weigeltosaurids. But the aptly named Wapitisaurus would have had to be a very unusual member of this group. It was the only one known from the Triassic side of the Great Dying Mass Extinction event. It was found in a completely different part of the world, and its teeth seemed more like those of marine reptiles like thalattosaurs. A new study has finally identified what this problematic reptile really was: a marine thalattosaur all along. Euparkeria is an extinct genus of Archosauriform reptile from the Triassic of South Africa. It is close to the ancestry of Archosaur and is among the most heavily described and discussed non-Archosaur Archosauriforms. It was a small carnivorous reptile with a boxy skull, slender limbs, and 2 rows of tiny teardrop-shaped osteoderms along its backbone. It is a euchrocopod, meaning that it was among the reptiles most closely related to true crown group archosaurs, according to specializations of the ankle and hind limbs. The hind limbs were slightly longer than its forelimbs, which has been taken as evidence that it may have been able to rear up on its hind legs as a facultative biped. This conception supplemented older studies which interpreted Euparkeria as a particularly close relative to fully bipedal early dinosaurs. Its normal movement was probably more quadrupedal, with limbs positioned in a semi-erect posture, analogous to a crocodilian high walk. Biomechanical analysis suggests that it was incapable of even short periods of bipedal activity. Mecistotrachelos, a gliding reptile from the late Triassic, was the first fossil taxon to be described based entirely on CT scans. Although its exact evolutionary relationships are still unclear, it's currently thought to be a proterosaur related to Triassic oddballs like Tanystropheus and Cherovipteryx. It had elongated ribs that supported a gliding membrane, a feature that convergently evolved several times in different fossil reptile groups and can be seen today in the flying dragon lizards. Unlike other known rib gliders, however, Mecistotrachelos had a particularly elongated neck. The ribs along the leading edge of its gliding membrane were also unusually thickened, with enlarged joint articulations, suggesting that it might have had specialized muscle attachments to precisely control the position and curvature of its wings while in flight. Mambaschaton represents the earliest known branch of the Avemetatarsalia, or birdline archosaurs, a major group of the archosaur reptiles that also includes pterosaurs and dinosaurs. It's only known from a few fragments, but it was probably around 2 meters long, and would have been a carnivorous lizard-like animal with a long neck and semi-erect quadrupedal limb posture. Unexpectedly for a birdline archosaur, it also had a staggered double row of bony osteoderms along its back, suggesting that the very earliest Avemetatarsalia had some crocodilian-like armor. This seemed to have very quickly been lost, though. There's no sign of osteoderms in the next branches to split off after Mambaschaton, the Aphanosaurs and Pterosauromorphs, and although they occur again later in one dinosauriform and various non-avian dinosaurs, this appears to be multiple cases of independent re-evolution rather than retaining the original ancestral trait.